welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us. We are on Zoom, virtually connected once again. One of these days, we're going to actually be together, and we were just talking about it. We were just talking about doing a tour in the Pacific Northwest. So we're working on a tour that would take us, hopefully, Portland, Seattle, and to Moscow. But it's all just sort of nascent right now. Don't get too excited. We don't have anything specific to tell you, but that's in our minds. We're thinking about it. And Glenn Sunshine is now a free man. And so he can do all kinds of things that he used to be unable to do.
Almost. Great.
That's right. Still got grades. Well, like I said, this is a Theology Pugcast. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve here in the Pacific Northwest. I live in a cool town called Battleground, Washington. And it's got a kind of feisty feel to it. It's very unlike the kind of the stereotypes that people hold in their minds when they think of the Pacific Northwest. This is sort of like the place where your veteran, your uncle who fought in the Vietnam War, hangs out with his buddies on the street. This is like, the town where you've got the VFW, and just a bunch of ornery old libertarian dudes. So that's where I live. I live in Battleground, and I'm glad to be here. But anyway, enough about me. We're going to make the rounds here. It's just the three of us today, and today is Tom's day. So why don't you introduce yourself, Glenn, and break the news or to all of the folks who don't know yet.
Well, my name is Glenn Sunshine. I am a retiring professor from Central Connecticut State University. I just had my last class yesterday. As of when we were recording here, I've got exams coming in next week. With any luck, I'll get some laughs out of them. I've had some great quotes over the years. And after that, I am done at the university and moving on to bigger and better things.
All right.
I'm also a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm supposed to mention that too.
All right. Well, we're glad you did. And Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and then give us the introduction to the topic of the day? It's going to be a fun one.
Okay. I'm Tom Price, systematic theologian and Christian ethicist. I teach both at a variety of places, one of which is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And so I am not retiring yet. In many ways, I haven't even gotten into a situation into which I need to retire. Although I feel retired sometimes.
Yeah, you're looking
project this summer coming up, and actually now that the summer arises, I've got 2 books in mind, so we'll see how that goes. I'll keep announcing it drip by drip as we get closer to what they're going to be about. And I had another point and I forgot what it was, so I am nearing retirement in my memory capacity. So what is the topic for today?
If I can.
By the way.
Before you go, there's something I should probably also mention. Speaking of books, I just got another contract from Canon Press.
All right.
For a book, working title, Christians Who Changed Their World. It's a series of short bios of different people you've never heard of who've had a big impact on the world.
Nice. That's great to hear. Good stuff.
And we've only mentioned it when we've had a few rounds of drinks together, a book idea I think that Canon would like, and maybe we need to talk about it again. We'll both be hilarious, but also informative. But
so you're kind of fading in and out.
I'll keep that under the wraps until we can kind of. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're kind of fading.
Hopefully not. But anyway, we have another book idea that we talked about in a pub, but we haven't announced what it's about. So, so we have a lot of stuff in the works. But anyway, today is something that is a topic that I think is fascinating. Am I coming in okay now?
Yeah, you're coming in okay. You kind of cut out, at least for me, a couple of times.
Okay. All right. I hope that doesn't continue. Am I okay right now? Or okay. All right. So the topic of today is going to be broad and narrow. In the broad sense, it's going to be talking about kind of the history of virtue, Christian virtue in particular, its significance, its import, its complications, but then narrowed down to something I think that is a missing virtue in the modern world, in the contemporary world, which is temperance. And what I mean by temperance is not the temperance movement. And so, yes, so
let me drink to temperance.
Yes,
I'm drinking to temperance.
You can surely know that this is not what is meant in our understanding. But the virtue of temperance, and I'll unpack what that means, as we go on with the show. But one of the things I wanted to start with was an interesting article by Ed Feser. He's kind of a philosophical theologian in the Catholic tradition, but he wrote a fun article called "Woke Ideology is a Psychological Disorder."
Yeah, it's a great grabber of a title, and I like him. I like the American Mind in general. That's where it's published. Yeah. We should probably make sure we have a link in the show notes to it.
And Ed Feser's fun. He and Dave Bentley Hart used to kind of throw back and forth, and it's being Reformed, which I think neither of them like that much. But on the other end, we can kind of see that both of them, from my perspective as a Reformed thinker, both of them are wrestling with two sides of something that we wrestle with ourselves in the Reformed tradition, and I think actually can be held together as well. So it's interesting that in the wide branch of Christian history, we keep wrestling with the same issues no matter where we are sitting. I'll explain that a bit later. But anyway, the article is pretty fun because Ed Feser's looking at Plato, and he's kind of unpacking Plato's idealistic vision of what a good human society is, and what makes for its deformations, and what tends towards the worst deformation, which ends up with tyranny. And the reason it's interesting is because it really is a kind of what you would say a philosophical reflection on, kind of where we are in our own society in many ways.
Before you go any further, Tom, I think it's important for us to help our people understand that when Plato is referring to psychology, he's referring to it in its original sense. He's not talking about what we normally associate with psychology today.
Yes.
So to kind of sort of help people see that, let me just say a couple of things. One is most psychology today is kind of a medicalized approach and a kind of mechanistic approach to the operations of the human mind.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which you're treated for a psychological disorder in the same way you'd be treated for, like, I don't know, tonsillitis or something. It's something that you're not morally responsible for your psychological state.
That's
whereas this is all about your moral culpability for your psychological state, because psyche is the term. It's the soul, right? And so how the soul is ordered is something that we can take responsibility for, and we actually should if we're well. In other words, if you can't, then that's an indication that you're not well psychologically.
Yes, that's right. And another thing is it's an indication that you're not human, because that's what the beast can't do. I understand the kind of polarization that often happens in a lot of contemporary theology between, a pure Christianity and a Greco-Roman paganism. I understand it, but I also reject it because I don't think it's fundamentally Christian, and I also think it's misguided in understanding what Christians do. The early church was not about absorbing pagan ideas, synthesizing them, and then coming up with basically a pagan Christianity. What they were doing is recognizing things that were agreeable within the created order to a proper understanding, purifying them, renewing them, and then orienting them towards a fuller Christian vision. And so what happens is the early Christians didn't see the need to go get rid of faculty psychology because they agreed with most of it. They saw that most of it, a lot of it had a lot, was shared. The view that there is something more than our material natures, that there is something to our reason, a place for our reason in the balancing of our human natures, so that we are governed as Christians understood it, as we biblically reason. We order our loves the right way towards God, love of God first, and all things in that relation. And by doing that, we order our affections, our loves, and everything else towards their ultimate end, which is communion with the triune God. So there wasn't the kind of antithesis and oppositionalism that we oftentimes think of when we look at it today. Is just, look, it's all or nothing. It's either you just have this pure read a text, proof text, this is all you have to deal with, versus there's all this stuff about the human being that we can't really talk about because Scripture doesn't talk about it directly.
Well, but there are places where in Scripture we do find things that are very sort of commensurate.
Yes, that's right.
With Plato's vision. So, for example, when Paul argues that we can, in Romans chapter 1, that we can see the unseen through the seen.
Yes.
And then in Corinthians, where he talks about things that are seen are temporal, but unseen things are eternal. These are things that Plato would have raised his hand and said, "Amen, brother. Amen."
Absolutely right. And the interesting language. I remember that Andrew Louth is a professor at Oxford. He's a patristics scholar, and one of the things he said is that a lot of people don't realize the New Testament was written with a shared milieu with everything else around it, and so there wasn't this kind of Adolf von Harnack notion of one spirit tradition versus another in which they're in conflict and one pollutes the other. It's the big vision in which they orient everything. And, so in another way of looking at it is that, the whole creation belongs ultimately to God. And so in its fallen state, there's going to be echoes of truth that God providentially and through common grace, to use kind of the Reformed tradition in the Dutch tradition, those things are there, but they need purification. They need renewal and reorientation. But when the early Christians stumbled upon Plato, they were kind of shocked that he knew some of the things that he knew. And they even said, maybe he bumped up against this in Egypt, or, when he went down to study, he bumped up against something of Moses, to which I think someone sent us a question for Glenn Sunshine to ask the legitimacy of that. So I'll pause for a minute to let Glenn fill in that topic.
Yeah, well, the short answer on that is there is absolutely no evidence to indicate that occurred. Now, the response I got to that is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But on the other hand, that is sort of the worst version of an argument from silence. I think it's really unlikely to the extreme that Plato, Herodotus, any of these guys really encountered much in the way of Israel, the law, or anything like that. Having said that, the thing the assumption that they had to have seen this is really a reflection of a really weak view of common grace.
Yeah.
The idea that, and this is the problem I've got with a lot of guys in the Reform camp, that if you like the Van Tillian argument that basically, if you are not a believer, there's no way you can understand anything about spiritual things. That's a very weak version of common grace. The strong version of common grace says that, well, actually, Paul meant what he said in Romans 1.
Yeah.
And that there are things that a well-ordered reason, even in the absence of revelation, can deduce about the nature of reality.
So on that point, Glenn, are we going to get into a little bit of the psychology that Plato lays out in the Republic? Because I think because my experience with some of the people we're referring to here who have a very weak understanding of common grace, they've never actually read Plato. Mm-hmm. In other words, they've got basically the same mindset that Richard Dawkins has, which is, well, if it's wrong, why read it?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So Richard Dawkins says,
tell us what it means, even though you haven't read it.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the thing. But like with Richard Dawkins, when people challenge him and say, "Have you ever read any really sort of sound Christian theology?" He'll say, "No. Why should I? It's wrong." So in other words, these people who just dismiss the Republic without having read it, mm-hmm. or who when they do read it are just in this frame of mind that I described earlier with the hermeneutic of suspicion. There's a Christian version of that, where all you do is the only purpose for reading this stuff is to find things that are wrong, so that you can say, well, there you go, it's completely worthless. Let's just go ahead and not read it at all. But when you read the Republic, you get certain things. For example, let me just use this as an example. C.S. Lewis is known for saying, that one of the problems that we have is we have men without chests. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't know anything of what he means unless you've read Plato and the Republic.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what the psychology that is laid out in the Republic is describing.
Yeah. 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 Glenn?
No, I can't, I couldn't agree more with that. And, the fact of the matter, it's what we were talking about with mythology several episodes ago.
Yeah.
The Tolkien's idea of redeeming myth, that the myths express genuine truth, but they need to be purged of their pagan elements and Christianized in order to reach the full flowering of that truth. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with Plato. It's the same thing with any of these guys. There is a lot of value there. There's a lot of truth there. I think common grace extends a lot further than we're willing to give it credit for.
So why don't we get into a little bit of what did Plato say? So do you want me to summarize it, Tom, or were you planning to?
Well, why don't you summarize it, and I'll kind of build off of that, because I think it'd be a good way to unfold it.
So essentially, and this is what Feser's talking about, you can't have a sound political order unless you have a sound psychology or anthropology, maybe another way to put it. Yeah. So what Plato does in the Republic is he lays out, all within the framework of the subject of justice. What is justice? You can't really define justice from Plato's perspective unless you have an understanding of what a human being is, and then how a society works in a sort of like enlarged sort of version of the person. So you get the body politic. So like we see this language in the New Testament when we talk about the body of Christ. When we talk about the body of Christ in the New Testament, obviously we've got the head, who is Christ, who is the Logos, who is the reason of God. Yeah, right. So you got the head, and then you've got the body, which is oriented toward the head and directed by the head, and you've got division of gifts and roles and offices and so forth. Now with Plato, you've got a tripart sort of understanding of the human being. So you've got reason at the top. At the bottom you have appetite, and in the middle you've got virtue, or this sort of this capacity for moral action. So when Lewis is referring to men without chests, what you have is a reference to this very tripart understanding: head, wisdom; chest, virtue; stomach, appetites. So men without chests is implies that these are men without virtue, because you need wisdom to direct virtue and virtue to direct the appetites.
Yes.
And if a person is disordered, out of order, it's when what happens is that the mind and the head and the chest become the slave of the stomach.
Yeah.
When that happens, and that's, by the way, is language that Paul used.
Yes, it is, and it's interesting. And Feser points out that what Lewis used by chest was psyche or spirit, or thumos is a hard to translate word, but it's an impulse to correct injustice. It's in the pursuit of what is honorable and avoidance of what is shameful. It's that which, like you said, takes our rational nature, and it's a medium almost in which brings the appetites into conformity to it. And of course, early Christianity sees the Holy Spirit as the governing principle of this for Christians, when it starts to renew and reconfigure this notion of virtue. But Ed Feser gives us great points. He talks about this thing you talk about, the point, the chest, if you will. Suppose a man sees an old woman being mugged, and though fearful for his own safety, nevertheless rushes to her aid out of outrage for what is being done to her. or suppose he's tempted to sleep with another man's wife, but refrains from doing so because of the shame he feels in the thought of it. This would be instances of this virtue or the spirit coming to govern the balancing of the two. So the reason tells the man to risk pain in the first case and ignore pleasure in the second. Appetite might still overwhelm him if it wasn't for the spirit counterbalancing the emotions associated with justice and honor. So there is this harmonizing. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, this is also the reasoning or the logic that is employed by James in his epistle.
Yeah.
This is all when he talks about, you ask and you do not receive because you want to spend it upon your lusts.
Yes. That's right. And so pneumatology for Christians begins to replace what would be an insufficient pneumos, if you will, or thumos for Plato. So for Plato, for Christians, what was wasn't fully defined. The early Christians would say, no, you need the genuine work of the Spirit here to actually carry this work out and bridge this gap, if you will. And so, but what this ends up doing is balancing a person. So in the Christian life, we understand conformity to Christ. I mean, our virtues are accomplished in conformity to Christ and keeping the law of Christ, if you will, the virtues of Christ, participating in the virtues of Christ, the fruit of the Spirit, however you want to talk about it. But it's the Spirit that is the agent and principle of it. But as being the agent and principle of it, we still have a human correspondence to that, an outworking of it, which is is consonant with these virtues. And so, but anyway, I'll move back to that. But with Plato, what he sees is this kind of psyche is matched in political orders. And so again, he's talking idealization. He's not saying there's any real genuine instance of this, but there are. In every instance of society, there are these elements at work. I mean, that's kind of what he's up to. And one of the things Fazer points out in the in his article, he goes, in another term for these virtues, by the way, is excellences. And excellences are not things that we as human beings have as possessions of ourselves. The early church and Christians historically, and Reformed in particular, especially the early Reform, understood these as participating in the perfections of God. These are the ways in which certain communicable attributes of God become measurable in our own lives. Sanctification, if you will. Right. So there isn't such a discontinuity there. But anyway,
that the Greek word that's usually translated virtue is arete, which refers to this idea of excellences. So all of the stuff that we've said about virtue in the past, the Greek equivalent of the Latin virtus is arete or excellence.
Yes. Yeah. Great point. What ends up happening is in Fazer's article is he talks about healthy and sick society. So he's unpacking the next part of it. So reason, spirit, and appetite, this tripartite notion of the self, are to be found in all human beings, but each is stronger in some human beings than others. And there are three social classes in Plato's kind of ideal society that you could fall into. And he notes that the vast majority of people will fall out into the appetitive. And do any of you want to kind of unpack what the appetitive would be?
Well, basically, when we think about the stomach, now this doesn't mean that people are kind of out of control or addicted to things, although it could lead to that if you don't have these other things present and working in you. But essentially is, you're kind of trying to make a living. But you know what I'm saying? So you're trying to, provide for your family. You're wanting to enjoy certain sort of creature comforts. There's nothing wrong with that. Good beer, for example, that's a
that's right.
So
crafting good beer for that matter.
Right. So, craftsmen, people who work, you can be a virtuous craftsman. You can be a virtuous farmer. You can be a virtuous, but these are people who are oriented to just sort of like life on the ground. I mean, they're just trying to get through the day. They're working hard. but they're not sufficient unto themselves. In other words, the appetites have to be informed by other things. And the way they're informed is what Plato is concerned about. But there are also people, and you've noted this, for whom these other things, the spirited, like last week we spoke with Nate Spearing. So Nate is obviously the kind of person that Plato had in mind when he's referring to the chest, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So that doesn't mean that people who are, sort of in which wisdom is dominant don't have the ability to be spirited. But it just means that there's a kind of preponderance.
And there is an interesting thing, because I think Christianity starts to break down some of that hierarchy. And it says, this was, I think, the Reformation principle. That was that, you can do this for the glory of God, the higher end, and yet accomplish the appetite of man. But we can kind of get that. But yes, in Plato's categories. Glenn, you had a point.
Yeah, the way that I would look at this is I would go to the way the medieval society envisioned itself. Yeah. Medieval society said that there were three orders in society. In reverse order, by the time you get to the French Revolution, it's three estates. Okay. In reverse order, the third estate or the third order are those who work. And these are the people who are involved in production. Work is understood as production.
And this is exactly what Plato means by the appetitive class, exactly. The productive class, the farmers, the merchants, the laborers.
The second estate are those who fight. This is the warrior class that is responsible for protecting society against physical enemies.
And for Plato, that's the spirited, oriented by temperament to honor and justice.
Yeah. Now the first estate is where things get a little dicey here.
Yeah.
The first order or the first estate were those who pray.
Okay.
And by that, in the Middle Ages, that meant the clergy. But I think it's connected. I think in their concept, it's connected to what Plato was saying.
Yeah.
Because in Plato, the philosopher kings who are ruled by reason, philosopher is not what we mean today by the word. Today, we think of guys in tweed suits with elbow patches in an ivory tower.
Yeah.
What Plato meant, and probably a pipe, by the way, what Plato meant was people who actually saw and in a sense understood the forms or the archetypes that underlie reality.
They were the spiritual class, if you will, in the full sense. They contemplative divine things from Plato's understanding.
Which, when you think about it that way, in the Christian context of the Middle Ages, that really does sort of align with the clergy, but there are some significant differences.
But in Plato's case, just to mention from Phaser's point, is that they weren't traditionally allowed to own property or marry anything else. They weren't allowed to basically be manipulated by the appetites. And this is why they were sort of a governing class, because they were supposed to pursue these things for their own sake.
Yeah, and we have, people who complain all the time about the ulterior motives of the people who rule us.
Yes.
We talk about, corruption, but we can also speak of corruption even amongst intellectuals. When we think about the new class and the bureaucracies and stuff like that, it's very easy to see, if you think about it, that even people who are ostensibly serving us, in the pandemic to, protect our health, do get some other benefits.
Well, and see, this is what's interesting about Plato is he would not have liked that. He would not have considered them they would be governing from a degenerate form of ruling. And you can see why when Christianity started to organize itself in these environments, they understood that priestly class is trying to not be chargeable by manipulation of power the same way that, a Fauci can get all this, like I said, I don't know his situation, but how people can benefit from their moralism and their spiritual state.
So what you're telling me is that when Boniface VIII declared a crusade against his a rival family, But that was an abuse of power.
Yeah. So now we could challenge Plato on the
Yes.
measures that he took to
That's
try
right.
to keep the philosopher class pure and uncorrupt.
Yeah.
But his point was
Yeah.
that people can do things for the wrong reasons, and when you do something for the wrong reason, it actually corrupts not just you but your way of thinking.
Yeah.
So in order to keep thinking clear, you need to make sure that you recuse yourself from from making a judgment on something that you would benefit from if it were sort of decided to be if the judgment works out in a particular way.
Yes.
So I think that related to this is the idea of a philosopher, and you noted this, Tom, is that today we have this image that Glenn described of someone who's kind of out of touch with reality. And the challenge is, how do you sort of prescind yourself from the influences that could corrupt judgment, but at the same time stay in touch with reality to the degree that you need to be in touch with reality, so that you have a full appreciation for what's going on around you. Philosophers today don't even try to do that. I mean,
that's right.
We're in a very bad way right now in our civilization. And one of the great things about the Republic, and this is what Phaser's trying to bring to the surface, is that Plato, if you read Plato, if you read particularly his treatments of democracy, which he did not consider a good thing. This is one of the things that shocked.
It leads right into tyranny. We'll get to that. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you read him, it's like he just read the New York Times this morning. Like,
yes.
So this is so relevant. When you read the Republic,
it is.
You're like, and then Phaser says it. Did he get into a time machine? Did he know exactly what we're doing? Well, the reason why he could say the things he did and be relevant to us today is because reality, truth is not, so contextualized that every moment in time is sort of its world unto itself. There are permanent things. So Plato is able to apprehend certain things that were eternally the case.
Yeah. This is what attracted early Christians to what he was up to, even though they knew he needed to be renewed.
Right.
Mythologized. Glenn, you were saying something.
Yeah, human nature is what it is. And one of the things that I try to teach when I'm doing history of worldview, or the impact of worldview on history, is that any worldview, when it's dominant for long enough, will inevitably lead to its logical, or in many cases, illogical conclusions. It will go where it's going to go. And Plato, this is the genius of C.S. Lewis, or Plato, or any number of these other people who seem just amazingly prescient. What they can do is that they look at the implications of a particular set of beliefs or a particular set of priorities or whatever, and they can extrapolate out to where it will lead if it's followed through consistently. That's all that they're doing. And because of the constancy of human nature, this works really well. Now, I say that's all they were doing. Very few of us have the ability to really think things through that clearly. So I'm not sort of minimizing the brilliance of what they actually achieved, but the process is really remarkably simple. Look at what the implications are, extrapolate it out, and talk about that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And I think what you see is, Oliver Donovan said it a very different way, but a very shared point. He says, the order of things that God has made is simply there. It's objective, and mankind has a place within it. Christian ethics has an objective reference because it is concerned with man's life in an objective, in accordance with this order. The summons to live in it is addressed to all mankind because the good news that we may live in it is addressed to everyone. The Christian moral judgment in principle addresses every man. not just Christian man. It addresses every man. And so his point is he says Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, which treated ethics in close correlation to metaphysics, he goes, this is because it's the way the universe is. What the reality is determines how man ought to behave himself within it. And so Plato sees this stuff, and he may not have it from the revelatory end that the fullness of Christ has, but he sees a lot of things. And so when we get into that, his sense of analysis is very rich. And so Christianity, it doesn't have to come into opposition to the kind of rich substance of it. It actually is able to run with much of it because it doesn't see it in conflict with what the created order manifests about itself. Now, something about Plato, he's an essentialist. He's someone who believes there is a real essence, there are real natures to things. These are not autonomous natures, contraventil. These are grounded in the eternal reality that has given them a source and is their ultimate end. And so because of this, they are discernible. You can discern certain things and you can trace them back to their prior spiritual fullness to make sense of them. That's the measure. And so what is interesting about Plato is he has a spiritual measure. This is contra to much of even the current evangelical world that has a materialist measure, that has a historicist materialist measure. If you want to talk about the providence, God's providence, it has a spiritual measure first. So Plato had resources from the echo of creation that puzzled early Christians so much that they thought it had to go back to Moses. It was that profound. So you can be, maybe John Frame and say, that's just paganism, throw it out the door. Or you could actually say, wait a minute, maybe there is something here that has to be processed through a fuller, richer Christian vision, and you can actually see there's something going on here. But let me go where that goes, and maybe we'll see. So where Plato goes is he kind of orders this ideal society, and this is a mental exercise, or it's what you would call a spiritual exercise, if you will. It's contemplating where does this go if you match these different imbalances in the human being with the social form they take. And he talks about sort of what is the ideal society in which people live communally together in the right kind of balancing of things. And so he talks about sort of the ultimate, he has a hierarchy going on. The philosopher kings kind of govern the whole, but the philosopher kings are not a socialist elitism, in which everyone, kind of materialistically can benefit, no one else does. He often talks about them that live communally in their forbidden spouses, families, and private property. Again, that's not socialism. It's actually so that they are not manipulated by the temptations of typical power to get a lot of advantage. Again, Christianity will reject that view of leadership, but in the end, it still will affirm that we need to be governed by something that doesn't compromise when we lead our attraction and temptation to profit and benefit, right? Anyone with power, let's just admit it from a Christian understanding, has the extreme temptations to use that to allow ourselves to manipulate situations for our own self-advantage and sin, And so Plato was smart enough to see and discern through common grace that there was something there. But what was very problematic for him was egalitarianism. He said that of the guardian classes, which was the military, imposed only on a few because, few were capable of those virtues, the honor virtues, the discipline for being able to basically rule through limiting violence. He would talk about that there are certain temptations that can grow in each of these classes that bring it to a degradation of society. The guardians is what he called sort of this military class. And he said, oftentimes the guardians want to take over that philosopher kings. The philosopher kings in principle would be the spiritual people who pursued truth and beauty and God for their own sake, right? Now, again, Christianity will break this hierarchy down. They'll say that you can, as a carpenter, pursue God for God's own glory and do your craft for it, right? But in Plato's vision, you have a certain order of people that their sole, it's kind of like the monastic life. Their sole purpose is to pursue God for God's own sake, right? And
I would say, Tom, that I think that the critical thing here to sort of note is that in Plato, there has to be kind of a hierarchy in the society.
Yeah.
If there's going to be a hierarchy of values.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hearing, the reformers say is that there can be a hierarchy of values.
Yeah.
And that hierarchy of values can be recognized by the cobbler.
Yeah.
And because of that, the cobbler wants his shoes to be as well made as possible for the glory of God. That's the highest value, is the glory of God, right?
Yeah.
And then other values, of course, follow from that. Seek first the kingdom, and these other things will be added to you as well. So the other values would be like, being able to provide for your family, being able to enjoy a comfortable shoe.
That's right. And so reason, which is very highly valued from all of early Christianity, is such that it governs the rest of the appetites. But reason here is not autonomous. This is not Ventilian, neo-Kantian kind of stuff. Reason here is something that is a comportment to being made in the image of God. It's grounded in God and oriented to God. And so because of that, but it governs the rest. So when it's ordered the right way from its source and to its end, God, right? The triune God, communion with the triune God in Christ, it's sanctified through Christ's work in the Spirit. It is able to actually harmonize the loves the right way, so that when we work on a shoe, we're not doing it in such a way that we are not forming it towards a perfection that was unattainable apart from that,
Yeah. Well, when Paul says you have the mind of Christ, right. He's not saying that only a few of you.
That's right.
The mind of Christ. He's saying that, we all have the mind of Christ as believers. We have access to the divine mind.
That's right.
Yes, which is on one hand radically egalitarian, but on the other hand radically hierarchical.
Yes. So and it's getting that balance. I don't even think we as Christians have gotten the balance right yet. I think we're still pursuing that balance.
But this is what, of course, we can say. One of the ways we can say that Plato has fallen short. He sees one thing. He sees the hierarchy.
Yes.
But he fails to recognize the divinity or the image of God in man.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting as I was working through the article, and it's been longer than I'd like to admit since I've looked at the Republic, and frankly, at the time I did it, I didn't really get the significance of what I was reading. But one of the things I found really interesting is this discussion of how civilizations degenerate.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when the old saying, fish rot from the head.
Yeah.
What ends up happening is, for various reasons, the guardian class ends up stepping in.
Yeah.
And rather than reason being the governing principle, now it's honor or glory or something like that.
Yeah.
That in turn tends then to break down to greed. They start working towards self-aggrandizement through greed and glory and conspicuous consumption, all those kinds of things, which moves you down into the people ruled by the appetite. Yeah. And then once you get there, it progresses step by step until you get to near anarchy, where people are indulging in all kinds of sexual license and a variety of other things. He's really very big on things that are current in our culture. And then that is ultimately going to break down with the rise of tyranny, both because of the need to restore order into the chaotic society that you produced through this degeneration, but also because it's sort of dictated by the logic of the trends themselves, that when someone who is sufficiently anarchistic has the will and the skill to enforce their views, that's how you end up in tyranny.
Yeah, I think that's one of the richest parts of the article, too.
I was really impressed with that.
Yeah, it's one of the things he says is sort of, he says, okay, let's move from the psychology to the kind of deformations of government. Oligarchy, democracy, very low on the scale, and then tyranny. And of course, he says democracy is the rule of the spirited part of the psyche in which honor displaces wisdom. So this is already moved down. I mean, if you think of it in the Christian vision, it's a move away from pursuing God's glory for its own sake towards pursuing God's glory for a certain kind of thing, something that starts to give a very this temporal highest order significance.
I think we see it all the time.
Yeah,
it's not hard to envision. Sometimes you'll have people who are kind of pious braggarts, if you know what I mean. They're sort of like this is what Jesus was getting at in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where you've got people who are fasting, and sort of looking very, very sorrowful in public, so that they can be praised for their piety, right?
That's right.
They're not seeking God for his own sake. What they're actually seeking is public approval. And Jesus says, well, you got what you wanted. Why do you want anything else?
Yeah. And so in Plato's mind, he's like, well, okay, your appetites are in check. It's sort of what Jesus, okay, your appetites are in check. You get that out of it. But in the democratic society, but out of honor rather than regard for reason or wisdom or the higher.
But this is where I think Plato and Jesus would have been completely on the same page.
Yes,
because they would both agree that the highest value. Now, Plato obviously didn't understand the logos as a person.
That's right. The summum bonum was he did not know the Trinity. That's right. Let's be clear for those people out there. He did not know the Trinity. Because of that, everything else is problematic. But
he still recognized that wisdom is at the top. And if you just want to look wise without actually being wise, you're looking for the honor that should be only accorded to those who really don't care whether or not they get honor.
That's right.
So then the same thing is with fasting or prayer. If you're looking for the social benefit of honor, rather than seeking God for his own sake through prayer and fasting, then, you're not actually seeking God. You're not actually seeking the summum bonum.
Yeah. And by the way, the term democracy comes from the Greek word for honor.
Right.
So, and you notice here, this is sort of what Charles Taylor's on to when he's talking about a culture of recognition. Everyone wants this kind of honor without character. So they want to be honored for whatever self-definition they kind of recognized. And there is this kind of, a democratic disposition in the current climate, Yeah,
we call it virtue signaling.
That's right. That's right. But it is interesting that you haven't eliminated it. It's not honor in the old sense of the word, maybe a valor that comes with a kind of set of, say skills or virtues that you've embodied. It's more but you think simply intrinsically by declaration that you are a person of X, Y, and Z, that you need to have been granted honor. And now, in a sense, there is something legitimate that in the image of God, but it's not in the prideful sense that I think a lot of this is disposed. The prideful sense is, I demand honor, and the humility sense is that we're all made in the image of God, and therefore we're image bearers, and therefore there is a certain way in which we have to orient ourselves towards that image that always affirms it. And I think Christianity, has always been in its better dispositions affirmative of that kind of thing. Yeah. And I think that is something that I don't think you find in Plato.
Yeah. Within the New Testament, of course, what we are referring to is self-righteousness. So,
yes.
So democracy A timorous person is a person who is seeking honor, public praise, now within a framework that's not oriented toward the one true God, but maybe towards something else like just heroism or whatever. But within sort of the world of Judea in the first century,
Yeah.
it's the same thing. You want praise, and so what you should do is you are seeking what should be given only to God.
Yeah.
But you're seeking it for yourself. That's self-righteousness.
And that creates what Phaser says following this is a highly competitiveness, which makes one weak, therefore makes the kind of timocratic level disposed almost to leading to oligarchy. Because he goes, for this reason, he goes, timocratic man's excessive regard for honor makes him so highly competitive. And because of this, Plato seems to think this leads him eventually to an unduly interested in money as a surrogate for martial accomplishment. In this way, democracies tend towards oligarchy. And then we're seeing oligarchy all around us. Is the first of the three degenerate regimes in which comes progressively to dominate individual society, but it is the least bad of them. Oligarchy basically thus take, the appetites start to take the upper hand over reason and spirit. And it starts to pursue basically money for its own sake. I mean, that's one of the things that you see about it. I mean, I think his way of putting it is the timocratic ideals of honor encourage give way, but they're replaced by bourgeois virtues like thrift, hard work, and respectability. But these are all done not for the glory of God, but for money and catering to our baser desires.
Yeah, if we can hold off 1 second, I want to back up to the democratic thing before we get into oligarchy. The thing that I'm struck by with this is viewing it from a Christian perspective. There's nothing wrong with the idea of pursuing honor and things like that. I mean, Paul talks about this in Romans 2. The problem with it fundamentally is that when you're pursuing honor in this way, you're ultimately looking for your affirmation from other people. That's really what this whole thing is about, that you want other people to recognize how great you are.
And we see that, of course, in Homeric literature, where it's all about getting honor. And what you're wanting is glory. Honor and glory are very. I think this would be an interesting thing to sort of reflect on at the end of the show, because there's significant overlap between these things. So, at what point do you go too far in your pursuit of honor and become a kind of theft? It becomes a kind of theft when you're trying to steal the regard, the glory of God. Sort of to accord it to yourself. One of the things I just want to say in passing, we're kind of getting to a point where unfortunately, we probably should start wrapping this up a little bit. Maybe we should do a second show on this.
Yeah, maybe we can. I mean, we don't have to do it next time. We can do it another time.
Well, but it's really good. One of the things that, I think about is that historically in the United States, families that we would refer to as privileged. Today, that's a pejorative term, but the past has just basically been a statement of fact. And the idea that to whom much is given, as much is required. There was an understanding that among sort of leading families, there should be martial virtue. And there should be martial virtue, and one of the ways you sort of encourage that is by requiring of your sons some kind of engagement in or service in the sort of the defense of their country. So oftentimes in the past, like we look at Britain, leading families, it was expected that the sons would become officers in the military. Right, at least for a period of time of their lives, or maybe there would be one who was sort of designated as being, he's the one who's going to serve in this capacity. But there was a sense of responsibility for that. when I was at Air Force Academy years ago, and our son Caleb was looking for college, and he was recruited by Air Force, we toured Air Force Academy, and they had this map of the United States. And on the map, they had a pin. Every class in Air Force Academy, there are 1,000 cadets. So freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, each has 1,000. And so the freshman class, this is a wall-sized, this is in the Barry Goldwater Welcome Center. The Barry Goldwater Welcome Center at Air Force Academy. They've got this massive wall-sized map, and there's a pin that locates where every cadet in the freshman class is from. Now, how many do you think, how many pins were in the 6 states of New England when I would visit?
I don't know.
Total of 6. All 6 states. So there was like 1 per state. There might have been like 2 from Maine, 0 from Massachusetts. You get my point. And New York City, the New York City metro area, 14 million people. How many pins? 1. Where do you think the pins were? Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama. They were located largely in the southern states. There were some in California and stuff like that. But I was ashamed.
Yeah.
I was ashamed that the governing class of our country has no skin in the game when it comes to the military.
Yeah.
And given the direction, the reports I'm getting about the direction the military is taking right now, it shows, because they are much more interested in creating their vision of what a proper society ought to look like, which has nothing to do with the way things really are in the real world, that they're setting up policies that are just going to simply get a lot of people killed.
Yeah.
And how many people have to die before we get because we all know that the capacity for these people on the left to sort of ignore reality is remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
They can go for a long, long time before they actually deal with the realities on the ground.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, it's one of the things, it's the potentialities built into realities, the ability to prolong a long engagement with it. I mean, that's part of God's providence and patience, but it's also part of, I think the judgment and its consequences. It's terrible to think of that. And one of the things I think, maybe it's something I should mention before we go, and maybe I don't know how we want to pick up with it, but I think where he talks about kind of there's these next stages. So you move from oligarchy to democracy, then to tyranny. And I think Prince had already kind of said in advance that tyranny is not simply just about having to give some kind of container to limit the excesses of democracy run wild, but it also has something sinister in it that actually leads to a kind of affirmation of that. And so one of the things he said, the first thing to keep in mind in the order to understand Plato's analysis of democracy is that he's not concerned with procedural matters. He's not talking about what we think of as sort of democracy, everybody voting, getting their own say. He's cares about is the character type that dominates that society. So he's more akin to Martin Luther King Jr. than he is, to what people are talking about, but in terms of procedural matters. So by democracy, what Plato has in mind is this notion of a libertarian and egalitarian society in which every individual is free to do what he likes, and sadly, I think a lot of Christians think that's what freedom means. Not freedom to truthfully enact what you are as a creature, but to do whatever it is you like. Bourgeois restraints on appetite disappear so that desires are checked only by the competing desires rather than by reason, spirit, or even the oligarch's middle-class stolidity. Democracy, as Plato describes, is basically what American society has become in the 21st century, so much so that reading Plato on democracy makes one wonder whether he had access to a time machine.
Yeah. Maybe what we could do is in the next show, we could kind of, actually take some, lift some quotes from Plato and say, isn't that what we're reading about every day? But, as we wrap up, here's what I propose. I propose we do like a 2-part series on temperance.
Okay.
So this could be part 1. But before we go, Tom, could you give us, a quick definition of temperance to sort of serve as a bridge for us into the next show?
Yeah, I mean, temperance in the way Christians typically understood. I mean, if you just want to go directly to biblical language, it's the way of putting off the old and putting on the new. It's a way of kind of withholding certain things so that our appetites, which are hungry for fulfillment, don't go in the wrong direction. And so temperance is a way of tempering those appetites so that they don't go into sinful directions, but they orient themselves to the good. And so temperance is not the temperance movement, and which is legalistic, which doesn't understand redemption and being filled with the Spirit and the life of the Spirit, but just sets a set of rules with don't do this, do this. Temperance in the fuller vision, in continuity with, but renewing and restoring, temperance as it's been classically understood, is in a biblical sense, the way in which we are able to flourish because we are not dominated by our sin state, our appetites gone the wrong way. I mean, one of the things that drove me to the whole topic was, I mean, you started to notice, I mean, I'm seeing fights at airports over something. I mean, chicken wings don't get delivered in the right time, and people break out in a restaurant and beating each other up. I mean, this is a place in which your appetite for food has so dominated you that you're not governed by anything higher than your appetite, to where you're killing someone over chicken wings, I mean, and this is not, I'd like to laugh and say this is peculiar here or there. No, but this is becoming something governing in our society, where people completely unhinge and are unguided by anything higher than their mere lower appetites, their sin drives.
Yeah, their gods are their stomach.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And interestingly, it ends up tying back to the issue of honor, that if you question them in any way, you're dissing them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So essentially, what we have, I would say, with a wide range of things that we associate with the left today, in particular, and that's one of the things that Faser's getting into, is that while there are fascist expressions of these problems, this sort of tendency most often finds itself kind of at the end of the process on the left.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that'd be a good place to kind of start the next show.
Okay.
But I think that this idea, when we think about the fruit of the Spirit, right, we start up with love and we end with self-control. Now, the thing with that is that we have a tendency to think of this as sort of like a list that is in order of importance, right? So it's like self-control is somehow like, at the bottom of the barrel. But I think that if you think more chiastically, if you think about it as sort of like a sandwich, a sandwich doesn't hold together unless you have a top and a bottom, right?
Yeah.
And so love is the top, sure. But self-control is, if you don't have self-control, you can't have love, you can't have joy, you can't have peace, you can't have gentleness, you can't have any of that other stuff if you don't have self-control. So self-control, what I would say, is sort of the mirror vision of love.
Yeah.
It's oriented toward love in a supportive sense and makes love actually real and sort of gets it on the ground. And I think until you can, this is where I think temperance comes in. I think because what we're talking about here when we talk about self-control is temperance. Is if you can't have temperance, sort of to order your life, then you eventually do end up with people killing each other over chickens.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things Christianity brings to the virtue conversation is eschatology. It's fulfillment of ends. It's the highest end that we are. And that therefore can inform us in a way to take those virtues and orient them the right way. And so what that means is, because Christ embodies the fulfillment of humanity, and in his resurrected life becomes something we can participate in. Therefore, we can orient ourselves away from those. That's the whole point of being heavenly minded, is putting off the old, putting on the new, being able to embody kingdom ethics in a way in which chastity is not something about losing out on one's freedom, but is actually fulfilling one's nature if one is single and not yet oriented towards their fulfillment of that particular part of their creatureliness in marriage. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of insight that Christianity brings to this conversation.
Oh yeah, and eschatology is huge because, Plato, Socrates, those guys essentially were, circular in their thinking.
That's right. Yeah.
And so they couldn't really
get there.
Yeah, definitely not. Anyway, we should wrap up. Anything you want to say in conclusion, Glenn?
Looking forward to next conversation.
All right. Well, same here. Anything you want to say as we conclude, Tom?
Nah, I think I said enough.
Well, anyway, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We really do appreciate your support and interest in what we do. One of the things I'd just like to say as we conclude is, as we endeavor to address the thinking of a wide range of people, when we address a particular subject or a particular argument, and we say something positive about the person, that doesn't mean we endorse everything that person ever said.
Amen.
I think that some people think that's the way it works.
I think I've noticed that too. I've quoted, Karl Barth, for example. They think, oh, you quote Barth, therefore you're a Barthian, therefore.
Right. We had the same thing with Heiser, and probably some people will say the same thing about us with Plato. No, there are many ways we disagree with Heiser, we disagree with Plato, we disagree with Barth. Just because we say something positive about anybody doesn't mean we endorse everything that they've ever said or done.
Yeah. So, except Jesus.
That's right, except the Lord.
Yeah, who is anyone save Christ Jesus? That's our motto.
That's right. So with that thought in mind, before you send another email to us, keep that in your mind as you write. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to the Theology Pugcast. Bye-bye.
Bye.